Vicki Davis runs the website, thetechnocratictyranny.com, and she used to run the channelingreality.com website. But the technocratictyranny.com is the new one. Great website, wealth of information. Check it out. She started as a computer systems analyst, and she brings that level of analytical thinking to current events and sociological changes. I've always been a huge fan of her work, so it is a pleasure to welcome you, Vicki Davis, and thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
I
I've
wanted
been
to.
looking forward to this. So.
Well, okay. Well, I just wanted to say as well that you sent me something on communitarianism, and I have to admit that I'd never heard of communitarianism. And I was reading up on it a little bit and watching some YouTube videos by a gentleman named Amitai Etzioni, aka Werner Falk, as he was born. And he was, of course, born during kind of, the crises of the mid 20th century. Family moves, all over the place. He ends up in Israel and he adopts the name Amitai Etzioni, and he becomes what he calls a communitarian, a meta-sociologist, as it's called. So I was wondering, could you tell me a little bit more about that, about communitarianism?
Yeah, well, I'm just learning myself. And actually, that whole, I found a couple of papers that he wrote. One about building community. I guess their whole ideology is around the idea that community forms the person, and that people within a community have a responsibility and privileges, I guess. I don't remember the exact phrase that they used, but that's the idea, is that people have to participate in community. And Hillary Clinton takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's based on that philosophy, that it's the village that forms the person. And parents seem to be cut out of the loop, in terms of the formation of character and ethics within a community, which is kind of what we're seeing now in our political and cultural lives. It seems that these communitarians have really kind of taken over, and through the schools, they're trying to take over the not just learning, but the culture and belief systems of children and young people. Only it's not really working out very well, because the community is rather perverted at this point.
And it's also diffuse, and there's no responsibility. It's kind of like the Jamestown colony, right? When it first started and it was socialistic, and they were like, to everybody's needs, like whatever, and so farming wasn't anybody's particular job. So everybody assumed everyone else would do it, and then everybody starved. And then when they remade the colony, they gave everybody their own plot of land and said, now, if you don't work, you don't eat. And all of a sudden, everything exploded. They suddenly had all these extra surpluses and stuff. So when you're depending on this vague idea of, the community, the stranger loves my child as much as I do, or more than I. I remember a school administrator kind of like, words to that effect. I mean, we were going and casting about for a school for our son, and the public school administrator was like acting like she cared more about our child than we did. And I think it even said words to that effect. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure we care more about our child than, and then you'll hear the teacher, kind of cop out after that. Oh, I don't get paid enough to care about this. So wait, I thought you cared more than the parents. Oh, you don't get paid enough to care, so this is the disconnect of people who think, oh yeah, I'm going to give my kids to strangers, and the community will love my, or do the character formation. And of course, the character formation never happens. And the kids grow up without values or ethics, as you said, and everything is crazy. But it is an interesting thing that it's an inversion, right? So in Aristotle's, kind of in politics, he talks about how the family unit is the building block, the nucleus, the atom of the civilization. And he says when you have a bunch of cousins living around the initial family. You get a tribe. When you get a number of tribes, you get a nation. And that was the historical way to look at it, that the individuals created the nation as opposed to the nation creating the individuals. So it is an interesting inversion.
Yeah, it is. And it's, based on what we're seeing in the United States, it's not really working out very well. I
Yeah, to say the least.
yeah. But I've just started looking at communitarianism, and
Mhm.
it when I saw who was involved in it, and one
Mhm.
person in particular, uh, William Ruckles House,
Mhm.
or yeah, Ruckles House. Um, I always look at the people involved in something to be able to know how much, how seriously I should take organization,
Mhm.
and what connections they have, how much power do they have to actually implement what it is that they're talking about. And Ruckles House is a very influential person. He was at, well, he was the first administrator of the EPA,
Mhm.
and he was also moving up in time. He was involved in Bill Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development,
Mhm.
that through their task forces basically redesigned the government, redesigned the government functioning, the systems of government, and basically moved us into globalization. So Ruckles House is a very key person. So the fact that he was involved when the communitarian network was formed in 1990, and Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development was initiated in 1993, that's a very close time frame.
Yeah.
So I think you could say that the President's Council on Sustainable Development was the implementation of communitarianism in the United States.
Well, it sounds like a rebranding of communism. Like there's that quote from Talleyrand, the French diplomat from the 18th century, and he said that one of the chief jobs of the politician is to come up with new names for old concepts that have become odious to the people. So, liberal gets replaced by progressive. The New World Order gets replaced, with Building Back Better, or the Great Reset, whatever. And so communitarianism sounds very suspiciously evocative of communism, you know.
Yes, yes, and I think it is. Um, and when they redesigned our government, that was at the time when the internet was just coming into place,
Mhm.
and or being opened up. The telecommunications system for the country was being opened up for everybody to jump on the internet and bring their ideas forth. But what it did was to provide a forum, a network capability for communitarians.
Mhm.
And so, um, plus the fact that the reinvention of government was all encompassing, inclusionary. It
Mhm.
meant our schools, our healthcare systems, our law enforcement and justice systems. I mean, entirely across the board, without any thought to the security of the country and what that was going to mean. I guess these people are truly believers in, quote, democracy,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
which is mass chaos.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about was how, like, the organizing principles of a society, right? So, like, if you would ask Queen Isabella in 1450, whatever, what are you? Her reflexive answer would be Christian. Her designator, her idea of the world was Christian, Muslim, Jew, whatever. And then the church stops ruling. Christendom kind of goes away and becomes the West, right? Christianity gets stripped out of it. We stop saying BC and AD in the calendars, and it becomes a before common era and common era and all this kind of, they systematically kind of strip away all of the underpinnings, the religious underpinnings, and then the nation state comes in. And the nation state's organizing principle is different than the church. The nation state's organizing principle was race. Like Albert Camus said that. He said that Bismarck had trouble kind of bringing together this modern German nation because they were so disparate. They had different languages and cultural habits and all these different things. And he said only when they introduced the concept of race could they kind of cobble together like this nation. Modern political Zionism is like that. It was formed within that same time period under the same influences. So they get a lot of heat now because they're forming Israel. But you have to remember, Israel was just formed in 1948. And so they're at the very beginning stage of the creation of a nation state, which means that they're going to be very they're going to put a lot of emphasis on group cohesion, on ethnic solidarity and all this kind of stuff, which is actually normal for the creation of a nation state. We're at the end stage ourselves because we're going away. So stage one was Christendom, stage two was the nation state, and the organizing principles are different. One, you're a Christian, the other you identify by race. And now when you go into this third iteration of rule by corporation, what is the organizing principle of that? And I'm not sure. And I think the communitarian answer to that would be what, like the internet, like technology kind of linking us together. What would be your as an expert on technocracy, what would be your decided opinion about the organizing principle?
Well, there is no organizing principle. What happens is
that's what I think too.
people separate off into groups of like-minded people, but they are not within a single geographic area. Mm-hmm. They're spread across the world. And so what you end up with is chaos, because you have this network of people like the communitarians, and they have this belief system, and they are hooked into government. Government has been converted to think along the lines of communities. And that was one of the concepts of the reinvention of government, was that the government would step back. And of course, they didn't entirely step back. They became the handmaidens of business that had globalized. So you have government working with business, and power rolled back to your local communities, mm-hmm. your states, where they're trying to implement what I would call a global value system. Mm-hmm. Where
like ESG and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, ESG and LGBTQ,
sustainable
diversity,
development goals,
equity, inclusion.
Yeah,
just all the things that are really incompatible in an organization of people, because they're trying to be everything to everybody, and you can't do that. It just doesn't work out, because everybody has different belief systems. And when you try to merge all of those different belief systems, it simply doesn't work.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, like in the sense of, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, finish.
Well, I forgot what I was going to say, so go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, that's horrible. Okay. That's okay. I'm sure I'll remember it.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just make the point. I apologize for that too. What I was going to say was that when you create a nation state, one of the things you want to do is bring people together. You're trying to unify the people, whether it's Oktoberfest or whether it's like some kind of Passover celebration in Israel or whatever. But you have these different things that you bring people together. 4th of July in the United States used to be that. And under the new technocracy, the corporate whatever you want to call that, they seem to want to keep people separate because they're afraid of a revolution. So everything seems to be to ghettoize people, put them in their different silos. You're not an American, you're an African American, go in this corner. You're not an American, you're a gay American, go in this corner, whatever. And the strategy, like we just saw through the last global event that we lived through, was to keep people separate, keep you afraid of your neighbor. My neighbor might give me cooties. I better stay away from my neighbor. He's got germs, like these things that are designed to keep everybody apart. So it is very interesting interesting, the silo effect of technology. We were told that it would be used to bring us together. But as you just pointed out, your so-called community might be this virtual community online where you're a foodie or you're a vegan or whatever. And you might be, oh, my friend is in the Netherlands or my friend is in, Brazil or whatever. But you never physically meet them. They're secondary kind of relationships. They're not primary relationships like family or church or anything like that. And that seems to be the MO, the methodology of the new thing. And I think this is why they so stigmatize racism. That racism is because racism brings people together, unifies them, it makes them a monolithic group, and that's dangerous. That's when you have nation states, but they don't want nation states. They're breaking up nation states. So now they're treating racism like how in the earlier iteration, the church under Christendom treated paganism. You're a witch. If you worship the old gods, you're a witch. And now, because that was their way of displacing antiquity, right? So when the Christian period comes in, so they had to destroy, utterly erase the past. And then, this happened again when the nation state got rid of the church. And then that became stigmatized. Separation of church and state, church is bad, And now that the nation state is being destroyed, racism is the new, you're a witch, because they don't want people coming together. You have to be separate. You have to think of yourself as an individual. And I think that's what you kind of were talking about as well. You were worried that on the one hand, we have communitarianism, but on the other hand, pitted against that is radical individualism, which is just as toxic. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, on the radical individualism that our generation kind of was introduced to through libertarianism.
Well, that's what I thought was so interesting about Amitai Etzione's, not just his paper, but in the forums that he organized and sponsored. And that was the dialectic, communitarianism versus libertarianism. Mm-hmm. And that was the what I perceived to be their intent, to be able to divide people. So you would have the people who insisted on individuality, and then the people who would wanted to form communities. And for communities, like small tribes, you might think, mm-hmm. More of a tribal thinking. And with all of your efforts and your all of your efforts focused towards building the community. And so and I saw that dialectic play out with libertarians in the beginning of my research, where all the libertarians were saying free trade, free trade. Well, free trade gutted our economy. Mm-hmm. And it was the trade agenda that began in 1962 when Kennedy changed the paradigm of trade. Prior to 1962, trade policy was based on tariffs, the prices of tariffs, and whether or not we let goods into the country. Well, after 1962, they included non-tariff issues, which means they opened up our entire economy to, which caused changes in domestic law, our domestic policy. Mm-hmm. Because when you're talking about, I would say clothes, for example, textiles, if you open up your economy to textiles, you're going to get massive imports, and you're going to put your own textile industry out of business, which is basically what happened.
I'm in South Carolina. Our entire economy was textile since the 1600s, and it was destroyed when Egyptian cotton came in, and different textiles from all around the world, and it just utterly decimated the thing. I want to make clear too to the viewers that are watching as well, that's a really good point about tariffs. If you look at our Constitution, the federal government was supposed to be funding itself with tariffs, excise taxes, and duties. That's how they were supposed to be funding themselves. But then when the globalists wanted to take away all tariffs because they wanted to harmonize the laws of the world, and it created less friction if there were no tariffs, so that they could do free trade around the world and enhance globalization. And so now how does the federal government fund itself? And the solution to that was a new federal income tax. and a new IRS to enforce that federal, so our entire government changed because of the removal of tariffs that the so-called free traders wanted to do. I mean, utterly changed our the way that government functioned, the dynamic between the states and the feds, which used to be the states are up here, the feds are down here, and then it got reversed. I mean, the fact that all this money is being siphoned out of the productive economy that's going to the IRS, or all these things, the IMF, so yeah, I mean that's a really good point about the tariffs, that Kennedy, the changing of the function of government.
Yeah, it that really did change everything. But let me switch gears for a second, and we'll get back to that. What the revelation I had when looking at communitarianism, what occurred to me is that what the United Nations is a metastasized version of the Commonwealth of Nations, the British Commonwealth. That was their association of colonies, and it was before before World War II ended. Winston Churchill and FDR got together. They signed the Atlantic Charter, so forth. And I think what happened is that basically Britain passed off their their organization of Commonwealth of Nations to a new organization, a new name for the same old concept, but they made it global. And
like so a shell company.
Yeah. And so the original 5 permanent members were the United States, Soviet Union, and China. Those are the big territorial powers. And then Great Britain and France. And both of those, Great Britain and France, were the colonial powers, right? And so they had this association, and gradually over time, our government has been handing over power to the UN, but at the same time, all of the wars that we've fought since the end of World War II has been for the United Nations, to bring all nations in under the umbrella of the United Nations. Well, anybody with half a brain would say you can't have absolute equality of nations when you have one nation that may have 500,000 people, and you have another nation like China, which I'm not sure it's really a nation. I think it's an empire, actually, where they have over 1 billion people. You can't have them on equal footing for decisions. It doesn't make any sense. It's insane.
I remember in Shadows of Power by James Perloff, there's a section in there where one of the Nixon people, and I can't remember who it was, gosh, I can't remember, it'll come to me, but he said that the Korean War was done, that it didn't have to happen. He said, but we needed to give legitimacy to NATO, which was new. So we're going to have this war basically to have, to get the people used to NATO, get the people used to the fact that all future wars would be fought for the UN, not for the United States,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that fits with the image that I have. And also Vietnam was a colonial, was a colony of France, right? Mm-hmm. And so we really had as a country, we had no business being involved in that. So I think what that was, it was a UN war. Mm-hmm. And they had our soldiers go in and fight that war. But in every war that our country has been in my lifetime, it has not been to win the war. They don't send our soldiers in to win the war and defeat the opponents. they just kind of come to a draw, or, a withdrawal of our troops, but it's not really to win. And so as I have been looking at the United Nations in that context, it makes sense from the standpoint of if I'm correct, and if the United Nations is a metastasized version of the Commonwealth of Nations, then it makes sense how leaders in this country, first of all, after they started the United Nations, they put all of the organizations that would be working within the United Nations behind the national security curtain. And so they've kept all of this secret from the American people, basically. I mean, I grew up knowing that the UN was out there, but how it was connected and what we do with it and everything else, I had no idea. But in other research, I found that there was a concept of superstates, 3 superstates. And the superstates would be the Soviet Union, not just the United States, but the Americas as a whole, and then China. And those 3 big territorial powers would be basically the rulers of the world under this United Nations organization. And so that's, why our political leaders are treating China as if China is a friend and an ally, when we know they're not. And why, after the Berlin Wall came down, all of a sudden the Soviet Union, the countries of the Soviet Union, is our best friend, right? Because they had this vision, and I'm positive that this is a British vision, of a world ruled by an international organization, i.e. world government.
Well,
And
I mean,
so,
you make a brilliant point. I mean, I never thought of it in that way. That this interview is worthwhile just for that insight that you gave, that the United Nations is a metastasized version of the Commonwealth of Nations. I'll suggest this. I was just watching a video of a guy saying, he was like, this is how billionaires avoid taxes. And he said, you can do it too. He said, set up a trust at the top, and the trust 100% owns this holding company. And now if there's any taxes or anything, liens or whatever, it goes to the holding company, and this holding company will actually be above subsidiaries. And you might have an LLC 1, LLC 2, LLC 3, and that's how it's set up, so that if you ever get sued, they can never take your money, because you're up at the trust, you're protected. You have no liability. You've outsourced it to this holding company that is now liable. And if anything happens, the holding company folds, but you still at the trust get to keep all of your money. And so after World War I, England was bankrupt and it owed all this money. It would make sense that for them to get away from a lot of their obligations, for them to create a new organization that they could offset their debt to this new organization. Let's call it a League of Nations, was the first attempt at this. And then of course it becomes the United Nations after that, after the United States kind of scotches the first iteration. But yeah, so they created a trust, with a hedge fund, with a holding company underneath. And then instead of LLCs, it's different nation states underneath. But it was really that is a brilliant thing. The British, they could no longer afford the British Empire, and that's why they lost India, because they were bankrupt. So in that state of bankruptcy, someone must have come up with an idea. Hey, let's create a trust. Let's create this fake shell company that we could offset all of our debt to, and we'll secretly still be running the world, still be running our empire, but we'll be running it through this new trust with this fake. Everybody will be looking at this fake shell company called the United Nations, but really we're still going to maintain this blind trust up at the top, and no one will know who the real owners are. That is a brilliant insight. I never thought about.
Yeah.
about it that
And
way.
yeah, you're exactly right. And that's what I've seen in the business arena is holding companies. Now, in the 1930s,
Mhm.
when the US declared bankruptcy, I guess, or went through a bankruptcy, one of the things that they did was to prohibit holding companies.
Mhm.
And the reason they did that is because of the electricity companies, the utilities, were doing that very model where they were setting up holding companies, and the holding companies would then invest in businesses that were unrelated to the electricity business, but that they would draw funding out of the electricity business to expand their empires through the holding companies. And so about 2005, they repealed the Public Utilities Holding Company Act
Mhm.
of 1935. So, but that's part of the reorganization of government, is basically dismantling all of the protections that we had that protected our not just the people, but the businesses within the confines of the United States.
Mhm.
And so they just put us out there in the global market where an American worker had to compete with an Indian worker or a Chinese worker, an IT person making $60 an hour at the time when they did this in 1995 to an Indian worker that was making an Indian IT person that was making $3 an hour, because geography was no longer a barrier because of the telecommunications
Yeah.
system.
That is, yeah, exactly. So that to them, as I said, so if in Christendom, this 1500 years, the organizing principle was Christianity, was religion, and then the nation state, it was race. Um, like I said, the only thing from their point of view holding it together would be those technological connections, that nexus, that world wide web that was not rolled out accidentally. Howard Scott, the founder of technocracy back in the 20s, he had all these ideas, kind of like how to meter a society. He was an engineer. How do you run and meter a society? But he didn't have the technology at the time to do it in the 20s. So then it got eclipsed by communism and fascism and all these other isms, which, by the way, are the religions within the concept of the nation state. Mussolini said that. He said that fascism is actually a religion. Right. So all the stuff that was under Christendom got morphed. All the isms are really just sects under the nation state model. I wanted to mention that as well, is that we're in a really interesting transitional period from the nation state to this kind of corporatocracy, this technocracy that's emerging. And so you have holdovers because we're in a transitional state. Like right now, Israel is getting excoriated by people on the left, and they're saying, oh, well, you're a bunch of, racists and this, that, and the other. But as I said, their behavior is very normal for the beginning of a nation state. It's very normal and I would argue probably healthy behavior. I would like to see all the countries of the world advocate for their own citizens and have group cohesion and ideas of demographics or destiny and all these things that bring people together. But Israel is in a weird place because under the time period of the nation state, anti-racism became the religion. Right. But so that's the religion of the technocracy, is anti-racism, division, keeping us divided. Whereas Israel is still in this 19th century model that they got from the German model, of Anschluss and all that kind of stuff, where they're still kind of, one foot is in the 19th century, and then the other foot is so they're basically being bit like let me put it this way. Some people believe that Christianity and I'm agnostic on this question, but that the Roman Empire created Christianity to basically train the people not to attack the Caesars, to love their oppressors, to turn the other cheek. And then, if that's so, this must have bitten them when Attila the Hun attacks, because they didn't rise up to defend the society because they were told not to. They were told to love the invader, love the enemy, and the society collapses because the people had been trained not to fight for their civilization. And so anti-racism was kind of like that. You're being trained not to fight for your people, that it is the worst thing to be patriotic. It is the worst thing to care about your tribe, your family. And so the Israelis are now like there's that the same boomerang effect that hurt the Roman Caesars, because they had trained the people not to attack them, but they didn't realize that by doing that they were also training them not to fight Attila, or to not to fight, they just, so now you have the Israelis who created this anti-nationalism kind of movement, but now it's being boomeranged back on them, and people are judging them by the metric of the technocracy when they're going by the metric of the nation state. And it's this weird kind of, like I said, this transitional schizophrenia that's happening right now at this moment in history. So
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because that seems to, if I'm right about the United Nations, and it was set up by the Foreign Secretary's Office of Britain, which is separate, which is a really, Britain itself is a really interesting nation. And we assume that they are organized in the same way we are, but they're not. The City of London is a separate entity which has Roman roots, as I understand it, roots in the Roman system.
Londinium, yeah.
Yeah. So if that's true, then the world system would be set up the same way, and they're trying to condition the American people to think the same way. Oh, God will take care of the problem that we're having in our country, so we don't need to do anything, because he's already planned it out and we win, which is really kind of insane,
Well,
to think that we don't need to do anything to protect ourselves because God is in charge of everything.
I was thinking, it's funny you mentioned the City of London, right? So you have this law-free zone called the City of London. It's not subject to the laws of England. It's a separate little mini state, sovereign in and of itself, has its own postal system, its own like everything, security state. The Queen of England has to ask permission to enter it. And then you have the Vatican in Italy, which has the same setup. Many people would argue that Washington, D.C. is one of these sovereign city states, that's outside the jurisdiction of what we would think of as the United States. And it seems to me there's something weird going on in the sense that as our inner cities start to collapse, you notice that they start to become almost like Vatican City / City of London sovereign city states that are above the law. Like you'll see, oh, we're a sanctuary city. The federal laws do not apply to us. We're going to resist. And you see this breakdown where they're destroying our cities and they're remaking them as these law-free zones, like all over. And Jeff Nyquist made a really good point. When I interviewed him, he was talking about how when Christianity came in and it displaced the older civilization, paganism and stuff, that it spread through the cities. The new culture spread through the cities, and the people in the rural areas, who we would think of as the suburbs, right? They were the pagans, which means pagano, which means someone from the rural area, hick, hillbilly. That's what pagan literally means. And so we suburban people, we're seen as the retrograde people who need the new culture. We're being phased out, and a new culture is being ushered in, and it's being ushered in through these new sovereign city states, these sanctuary cities that are patterned off of Vatican and City of London. So
that's exactly right. And that's according to the research that I've done, the idea in this country is patterned off of the Port Authority of New York, which is an agreement. It was agreed to by Congress that the two states could form an organization that sits above both states, that isn't involved in transportation, building transportation. And they become kind of a logical territory in and of themselves. Well, jump ahead to 1983, and Ronald Reagan signs a treaty with Mexico in La Paz, Mexico, and I just call it the La Paz Treaty. But an interesting thing that I noticed that I'd missed before, I just noticed this a couple of weeks ago, is that the La Paz Treaty created an international zone on the border, and the borders of the zone are so many miles into each state, but it runs the length from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. And because they are on an international body of water on both sides, they can become a port jurisdiction.
Interesting.
And under international law, which the British wrote, by the way, Admiralty law, a port jurisdiction is separate. And when I looked it up, the reason for that was because the port authority had to have as much power as a ship's captain. A ship's captain is God on the ocean, right?
Hmm.
He has control over life and death, everything on the ship. Well, once a ship arrives in port, the whoever the port authority is has to have equal power to the ship's captain. So a port jurisdiction is by definition international. And so, well, not by definition, in law, a port jurisdiction is under international law. So that's what they did to us. And that I always pictured it as a bridge over the border, but it's more than that when you consider that it's more like the City of London and, the Vatican and DC. It's its own separate international jurisdiction.
And it's funny you mentioned Admiralty law, because the national anthem of England is "Oh, Britannia, Britannia rules the sea." So they have the law of the sea kind of subverted, and it's a very different kind of governance structure. Like the governance structure of a republic is that you have participation from the people, whereas if you have a governance structure of a sea captain, it's a top down dictatorial, kind of, like you don't the Swabbies don't get a vote on where the ship is going.
That's right. And they might even ordinary men on the shore might get kidnapped to work on the ship.
Yeah, exactly. That it's funny you mentioned that, because before they used the term Shanghai, like the British would, hit an orphan over the head and he'd end up on a ship for Shanghai. Before that, it was called Carolina. And I live in South Carolina. And so if you read the book, what is it? I think it's Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, in fact. And it's the story of a British kid in England, gets hit over the head, ends up, as a slave, an indentured servant taken to the Carolinas to pick tobacco in the fields. And so many Americans got Carolina. So you're right. I mean, it even involves human trafficking. I mean, these
Sure.
corridors. I mean, we're not living in the world we think that we're living in.
That's absolutely true. And I never set out to do a study of the geopolitical organization of the world. I didn't, I started out looking at one system, the education system, and how there was a plan for the government to basically implement a management system that would manage American workers so that they could balance the inflows of foreign workers. The idea that they would fill shortages in the American economy with foreign workers, and that this our education system would be able to analyze what the job market is, anticipate what professions would be needed, and train American workers for those positions, which is a totally Soviet system. I mean, that's a communist system.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started looking at that, I was looking at the American education system. But then as I proceeded on, I kept seeing connections, expanding out the vision, and ended up, of course, at the UN and the Millennium Summit, where they're going to have world government, and where in 1995, the G7 countries decided on a list of 11 global systems that the G7 countries would build. But, when I was looking at that at first, I was looking at it only from US participation in it, maybe controlling the server that controls the function or whatever. But I realized, and I believe that this is true, that those systems were developed for the United Nations, which explains why our government, the management of our government, doesn't really seem to be American anymore.
Yeah, it's subordinate to this other organization. You have to think of that too. Our federal layer of government was a graft. We originally had the Articles of Confederation, and we were a true republic under the Articles of Confederation. And then if you read Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, he talks about how the international financiers, he said there were three groups basically that wanted us to create this new constitution. And one was land speculators, because they would sell land to people in the Kentucky territory. And when Indians would kill the new settlers, the people in the official states wouldn't come to help them, because they were like, hey, not my jurisdiction, not my problem. So they said, okay, you need some kind of federal layer that will protect people who are in non-states. That was one of the people, land speculators. Another was the merchant class. Wanted, kind of the King of England used to protect ships from pirates, and now American ships were getting hijacked and nobody was protecting them. And they said, you need some kind of federal, person to protect them. And the third were the financiers, and the financiers wanted us to rewrite the Constitution because of bonds. They had funded the Revolutionary War. We were paying them back in these worthless kind of fiat currencies. Each state had its own different currency, and they were, not as good as gold. So they said, you're going to go back to the drawing board. You're going to create this constitution where the dollar is pegged to gold, and we will have our bonds paid back with, a currency tied to gold. And so our federal layer of government was created by the international mercantile class and the international banking class. And so it operates at the behest, not of the American people, but at the behest of these international kind of bodies. And it was so since the very beginning. If you read the fights between Jefferson, who was there for so that same thing, that nationalism versus globalism, that was happening in the 1790s, where they were fighting. Is the government supposed to serve the people, or is this government supposed to serve international bankers and merchants? And the feds have always been international bankers and merchants, always. That's what the Federalists were the people who wrote the Constitution, they were so in bed with the Bank of London, Bank of England, that in the War of 1812, when England attacks the United States and is burning down the White House, the Federalists refused to release funds to defend the United States. And when asked, why aren't you defending America? They're like, well, we don't want to hurt our business interests in London. That was their answer. And they were so discredited that after the War of 1812, they were kicked out of power, and they just, the party disappeared because they were globalists from the get-go. So we don't need that federal layer of government. If we got rid of that altogether, we would get a republic again. But foolishly, we've kept that in place, and it serves the interests of these foreign bodies, and always has. So that's something that we have to contemplate.
Yeah, so in 1995, then, when they created the World Trade Organization, it was really kind of coming out of the closet, so to speak.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Actually, when after World War II, that's when they set up the international financial system. The World Trade Organization, which was called the International Bank of Settlements or something like that. They set up the IMF, and they were supposed to have set up an international trade organization. But the Senate wouldn't ratify the agreement on the trade organization at that time. And so we ended up with the GATT agreement, which was what was negotiated in uh, 1943 or whatever.
Mhm.
And so it operated as an agreement under the UN system until 1995, when they finally passed the legislation approving of the Uruguay round, which opened up our economy. It created the World Trade Organization. So it basically put that economic triad together
Mhm.
for a global system,
Well, I
which
mean, it's funny, like Aristotle said in politics, just I quoted it before, but Aristotle, he said, what are the primary functions of government? And he said that the primary functions of government are a military to defend the people, infrastructure, the building of infrastructure, a judiciary. And he had a fourth too. He said the temple, where the state, does religion, and the temple does the upkeep on that. But basically, let's concentrate on those three. So if you have those three elements of a judiciary, a military, and infrastructure, you have a government. And so what they did was they said, "Oh, there's no global government. That's a crazy conspiracy theory. That's not happening." But then they slowly did the pieces of what would be a government. So a global military would be NATO, right? And then you have the World Court in The Hague, right? So you have a judiciary, and then you have infrastructure through the IMF, and through the World Bank, doing infrastructure loans and stuff like that. And so now they have these Lego pieces that they can just click together, and there you have a functioning world government. And it's funny you mentioned too, the post World War II economic system. You mentioned the English setting up kind of the modern United Nations and the League of Nations before that. But it was John Maynard Keynes, an Englishman, the English economist, was the one who did the post World War II Bretton Woods agreement that would set the dollar as the kind of world reserve currency. And the hegemony that had happened in the post World War II period, it was not an American, really. It was that Englishman. It was he and Harry Dexter White from the U.S. Treasury. And Harry Dexter White later was busted for passing on secrets to the Soviets. Maynard Keynes himself was an open socialist as well, but Harry Dexter White was a communist mole, a spy. So those were the people who basically create, and they both, with malice aforethought, how they one of their directives was, how do we take power away from the United States and transfer it to this international body called the United Nations? And originally, Maynard Keynes wanted to create a currency called Bancor. And it wasn't going to be the US dollar that was going to be the reserve currency. It was going to be Bancor. So they were already, thinking, how do we gut the United States, take its power, still use its military, manipulate it, but basically quietly, shift their economic strength, gut their industrial base, just utterly loot them, and then shift all that to the United Nations. So yeah, so the English were were very much behind that. Vicky,
I
I'm going to give you one last word, and then we'll end it. So good.
okay. Well, I just have to say that the British are brilliant at organization, and the way that they set us up to be gutted was to put the United States basically as the leading organization defender of the United Nations. And if we ever want our country back, what we have to do is to declare the United Nations as a subversive organization and kick them out of our country.
Yeah, exactly. There was a general just recently, God, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but a modern general, and he said he was talking about like World War II history and stuff, and he said when they were figuring out what the post-war world would look like, the British showed up with maps, and they knew exactly where all the mines were in the world, where all the natural resources were, where all the rivers were. Like they knew exactly what the post-World War system would look like. And he said the Americans didn't. The Americans came and they were totally like a deer in the headlights. But the British, so you're right. I mean, they made it seem like, oh, the British Empire just disappeared. Kind of like J.R. Nyquist is a big proponent of the fact that the Soviet Union faked its own demise. There's, a bunch of people like Golitsyn and stuff, had warned about that. They would fake their own collapse, but really it would be kind of like a false front. And so likewise, the collapse of the British Empire was also faked. Like you made that great point that they just shifted it, their liabilities to this new, organization that they created, the shell company. But they were very, very savvy in what they were doing, as opposed to the Americans, who were just, kind of blindsided. They really didn't know what was what, and they had their lunch eaten. So
Mhm. Yeah, I picture our foreign policy and the people in it kind of like the story of mice and men. And wasn't his name
Lenny.
Lenny? That Lenny that was the big dumb guy.
Yeah,
That's
George and Lenny.
that's yeah, that's how I see the United States in this post World War II reconstruction. George the British were leading Lenny the dummy.
Who's strong. Yeah, the strong dummy. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And that's what we were. Okay, so I will leave it there with Of Mice and Men, right? Which is also a, biblical reference to all the plans of mice and men come to naught. And like the, geopolitics, all of our plans might come to naught if we don't pay attention. So Vicky, how can people find your work?
they can go to my website, thetechnocratictyranny.com. And if anybody has any comments or wants to say anything about it, my email address is on that website as well. And they can feel free to send me an email.
Awesome. That's very
If
brave
they
of you. And we do thank you. Your work is phenomenal. So I would encourage anybody out there listening to this to go and check out her website. It is breathtaking. So thanks, Vicky.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel.
I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching. If you'd like to stay updated, hit the like and subscribe buttons, but more importantly, if you don't want to see me reduced to shelling my old merch such as the Daniel Natal in action figure, where you can see Daniel engaging in an action as he watches TV, or engaging in an action as he surfs the internet, or failed products like the Daniel Natal Pez dispenser, or the even more ill-considered Daniel Natal urinal cake, think about supporting the show by buying one of my books. For instance, you can buy my book, Actionable Ethics. The link is in the description below.